Hey, so I'm a game developer that just completed making the demo of their game within 20 days, and I just learned the true importance of having explicit text in your game. The reason why this is so critical is because if you're showcasing your demo, your build, or again, the entire full release, you really want to make sure that players actually understand what's going on within your game. The more context you provide and the more instructions, the better. At the same time, giving these instructions might be a little bit more difficult to do in game than it is in the real world. If anything, if you have to manually kind of insert yourself and have conversations with your players to explain what's going on, you probably made a lot of poor design choices that are not optimized for, the explanation process of your game. So today I'm going to talk about the techniques you can use to teach your players how to actually play your build. Being said, the first one I really want to talk about is going to come down to sound design, meaning every single time something happens visually, you want to give a proper feedback of what that would sound like. And so, for example, if you have a gun and you shoot, you probably want to have a shooting sound effect so players can know, oh, there's projectiles. Maybe there's an enemy approaching and you can hear them stomping and like the volume increases. Again, there's going to be a lot of decisions that you have to make sure that sounds and visuals are aligned perfectly. Being said, check out this example of the sound design of this clip I'm about to show you. In the previous clip, you can clearly see for every action you take, there's an appropriate and associated sound effect that goes with it. But one test that you can run right now to make sure that your visuals are actually communicating what needs to happen is if you do a mute playthrough. What this basically means is you can kind of see if the effects, the camera, the game feel, the alignment, the characters, if everything on screen actually makes sense with what is supposed to happen. If you solely depend on sound effects, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but you really need to understand that visuals and sound complement each other. And ideally, you want to have both of them no matter what, right? But if you mute the game and if the visuals can solely carry the game on its own, then you have a very good visual design of what's going on. And this will help players understand what is going on in your game way more smoothly. All right. Being said, let's go ahead and start talking about the visual aspects of decisions and techniques you can make to improve your game's ability to go through the playthrough. Okay. And the first one I really want to talk about is going to be colors and saturation, specifically the importance of having outlines. You see, on the left here, you can see our character All Night with an outline. Here, you can clearly see the distinctuated shape that he has. You can see pretty much the colors he has on the foreground, and you can compare those colors with the background, and it's a very clear image. But on the right, you can see what happens when we don't have an outline. If anything, the sprite itself kind of gets a little bit blurry. It gets a little bit difficult to see what is the difference between the background and the foreground. And this bleeding effect makes it just way more difficult to communicate what you're actually supposed to look at and the details associated with it. So, not every single game is going to have outlines, but if you do have an opportunity to apply that, you should 100% consider doing so because it'll help you, again, clarify what you're supposed to look at. Being said, color choices is also extremely important, specifically for character designs. So just be very aware of which colors and which backgrounds you're using. Speaking of backgrounds, you also always kind of want to have dark backgrounds so that characters and objects and obstacles can go ahead and contrast more if their designs are, more bright, right? Likewise, if you have dark based characters, then you should have bright based backgrounds and levels. And by the way, there's this video called How Games Guide You Without Saying a Word, created by Gabriel Fuentes, who basically explains how strong level designs, can actually kind of show you what happens when you have these contrasting colors, right? And so it's really important to make sure that you have these abilities to highlight so that players know what they have to pay attention to in the overall context of what is happening within your game, all right? With the same contrasting features, if you have an empty plane or, just this image or screen where there are no text, the one piece of text that does show up will make it very obvious to point to, what is about to happen next, right? So you can see on the left here, we have this like giant grassy plain, two trees or rocks, some bushes, and then a house, your character. But there's no text on the screen except for the giant one that says next. And what that basically means is, hey, wait a minute, if I just kind of like took a step back and observed my screen, my monitor, where it says next is probably where I have to go, right? Now, on the contrary, if you look at the right side, this is a menu that, yeah, it's probably simple and such, but there's a lot of text on the screen, and it'll probably take a little bit of time for you to understand where you're currently located, what you have to look at, unless you have it, highlighted and featured correctly. If there are no highlights, then it's going to be very difficult to kind of see where you're even pointing or, what actually matters in this point. So make sure, whether it's colors, characters, backgrounds, text, just make sure that you have a strong understanding of how to contrast elements within each other so that the apparent and obvious shows up way more boldly than, everything else that just bleeds within each other. And I must exaggerate one more time. If you really want to make sure that something is as apparent as possible, use what's called explicit text. And this literally means artwork, sprites, anything that literally just words out what has to be done, right? So if you need to talk to an NPC, have a little talk bubble. If you need to fight an NPC, have a little, fighting indicator. If you get lost on a map or you don't know where to go, have a little pointer that says, hey, go over here, watch out for this. If you perform a counter or get staggered and you really want to communicate that, you should have these little like comic effects that do that for you. All right. Now, there is one limitation you really want to watch out for whenever you're drawing text, and that's basically language limits, right? So, as you can see on the screen, all of these texts are in English, right? But if I wanted to go ahead and change it into a different language, I kind of have to take the sprite, remove the actual words, and then draw the letters in, a different language. If it were Japanese, for example, I would have to use symbols. If it's Spanish, then I have to reorganize the text and probably make custom art for that. So be very careful with how you implement this, simply because it limits your ability to scale games with different languages. But nonetheless, it's still pretty important to have these effects anyway, right? One more other thing to pay attention to when it comes to like explicitness is the iconography of things. In other words, what if we had button presses? What if we had little indicators of where to go, right? So in my demo, if you are aligned with an enemy and if you're able to, be in range and attack them, the little R button would show up. And this means once you click R, you will perform your main attack. Likewise, in a dialogue system, when the sentence is finished populating, you'll have a little A button icon that kind of says, hey, you should like pop, it'll have like this little popping effect so that you press the A button and you can progress making text. These pieces of iconography will not only communicate to the player what needs to happen, but just give you a little hint of like, hey, you do this and you can continue to progress. This is also very important for games that have quick time events, so just pay very close attention to that. And in the context of quick time events, you probably want these buttons to take like 20% of the screen. They have to be huge, they have to be apparent, they have to be obvious, and they have to make sure that players honestly know what's going on. One more other interesting feature that I didn't really recognize until I got a lot of feedback here is the composition of positioning, which basically means where you put the item, object, or character relative on your monitor actually matters way more than you think. Typically, you would have a lot of important elements on the middle, right? You can clearly see that if you had like a HUD, if you had an HP bar or like a level progression meter, they could be placed on corners, and that's fine. But that means it's not necessarily taking the focus of what needs to be, instated. Anything in the center of your screen is probably going to take the most amount of focus. A little fun fact: anything that is on the center left actually just gets a little bit more attention than usual, which is kind of funny because if you have any document making software like Microsoft Word or Google, what do you call it, Google Sheets, you have the little indentures, right? And the reason why the indentures start off with the left side is because that's actually the part that humans kind of recognize the most. It's like a human psychological thing, which I thought was pretty interesting. But long story short, always make sure to center the most important things or kind of like put them a little bit more on the left. Otherwise, it's just going to get lost on the screen and it shows that there's a less important relevance towards those elements. All right. Another thing is when players are playing the game, they kind of ask like, what am I doing? What's the point? How do I do this? What are these features? What are these mechanics? And it is important to explain to the player, oh, press this button to do this, press that button to do that. Pretty important stuff. But you can also have NPCs that give you a little bit of a narrative context, right? So for example, there's this character called Prankster who indirectly or even directly tells you, hey, for every time you save a Fabler, we basically build a house, right? And so in game, your character's probably like, okay, I get to build houses by saving the bad guys. That's kind of crazy. But as the player, you're probably like, oh, so if I save Fablers, I can go ahead and make houses. I think that's a cool mechanic, or maybe that's a feature I want to go ahead and play with, right? So there's ways that you can use NPCs to your advantage and literally kind of world build while staying contextual and immersive, but also kind of spelling it out on their face, like, hey, if you save, you do this, right? Likewise, characters can kind of explicitly tell you their goals, right? Like, hey, I'm here to beat the game. I want to collect the crown. I want to dodge all these projectiles, right? So don't be too afraid to talk about it, but there's obviously narrative ways to kind of like ease into it and be clever, right? But don't be afraid to use NPCs to, talk to, basically, all right? And an example of kind of like all the lessons we have so far is kind of like in the screenshot, you have a character telling you, hey, you should probably bump into that suspicious looking cloud, or non-suspicious looking cloud. The entire background is dark. The only things that pop are the main character, the target that you're going to fight, and then you have the little like fighting context that says, hey, like go here to fight. All right, so that's just an example. The other thing that's ridiculously important, and we also have to be a little bit careful with this because sometimes it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's more ideal to have an intuitive design rather than a complicated design. And what that basically means is intuitive is, hey, just make sure it's simple, it's readable, that players can glance at it once and understand exactly what they have to do to make progress. Or complicated designs can just be very overwhelming in the sense that, hey, there's like a lot of information, and it's really bad to have like an overload of information all at once. So, there are games that obviously they have like very complicated UIs and HUDs, and there are players that absolutely love those type of games. And if anything, I would argue that it's because players have the ability to learn deeply about the game and they just understand what it is over time of practicing and just, learning what it is. But for your first impression where you have a new player joining in, they really want to see what your world is about, you really want to keep it as simple as possible. Again, your goal is to reduce friction so that players can just have an easier time investing in your game, learning more about it. And if they genuinely have an interest in it, they can go ahead and make the conversion in the future. And finally, the last lesson that I thought was very important, and it's kind of funny because like how I recorded this clip is like contextually helpful here. Uh, if there's one object, element, or item you really want to focus on game, like in game, you really want to make sure that you zoom in on it, that you have a camera that really like says, hey, like pay attention to this. This is very important. Again, keep it in the center. Make sure that you do all of these cool techniques to just emphasize the fact that what's important is in front of you. If you recognize that there's a bunch of elements on the screen, let's say multiple enemies, multiple goodies, a big level, then yeah, it's okay to take a zoom back, like you zoom out and you just let the players see everything all at once so that they can decide what to focus on. And as they approach another object, they should go ahead and have a camera that kind of like zooms in. So there's a lot of cool camera techniques that you can use, but the conclusion is, hey, like really make sure if there's just one object, one main focus, try to zoom in. It's going to be very helpful, all right? So being said, the recap of this video is basically, hey, just there's a lot of techniques you can use. These are the ones that we discussed to kind of just make it more clear for players to ease themselves into playing your game. Again, try to have clear visuals, a strong sound design, try to use explicit text as much as possible. Having a narrative design is going to be really funny, and then like using those NPCs to kind of hint out what's going on really helps out. Anything with indicators, highlighters, again, you're just making the experience as transparent as possible for players to enjoy your build, right? And one more thing is, you can't really know what to add or take away if you don't play test often, right? Make sure that you get as many strangers, as many players, those that are interested, fans, supporters, everyone that actually wants to like go ahead and play your game. Let them play test your game. Let them criticize it. Let them give you hints about what you need to do as a developer and designer to continue improving it, so that others can maximize the enjoyment of it. All right. So if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and check out my channel for more types of advice and such. And I very much hope that this helps you out. All right.